Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much indeed for coming, and thanks to the Frontline Club and to the BBC College of Journalism for organising this session. Can international coverage survive the digital age? We have with us tonight a very distinguished and powerful panel. But before I turn to them, can I just say a couple of words about the topic? As Julie said, earlier this year I wrote a report for Oxfam, for the Polish think tank at the LSE and for the International Broadcast Trust on the subject of international coverage on the British media. And part of the reason why I was commissioned to write that report was that it seemed to quite a lot of people that at a time when knowledge about world affairs was becoming ever more important, at a time when the world was becoming ever more globalized, at a time when the connections through the world were becoming ever closer and ever more important, at a time when, in Thomas Friedman's famous phrase, we're seeing the death of distance, there seemed to be some serious questions to be asked about the future of international coverage on the British media and on British television in particular. British television has an enviable reputation for its international coverage. It has done and is doing, still doing, some great things. It is far superior to many other countries. But the worry that was at a lot of people's minds was that we may slowly, inexorably, a bit like the frog being boiled slowly in water, we may inexorably be moving towards a situation in the United States where international coverage has become a rarity and where knowledge about the rest of the world is almost unknown. I think that it was also commissioned, this report, in the context of the wider debate about public service broadcasting and the future of public service broadcasting, which is still going on. And it seemed to quite a lot of us that a lot of that debate had been about the technology, in Stephen Carter's famous phrase, about the plumbing. It's been about broadband, it's been about access to broadband, it's been about 3G, it's been about the technology. Not much of it has been about the content, in Stephen Carter's words, about the plumbing. And that seems to, but there's been some debate, obviously, about local news, because MPs like getting onto local news programmes, partly, I suspect. There's been some debate, and very good too, about the future of children's. But not much else about what, in the future of public broadcasting, you, as viewers, as licence fee payers, as people who pay for public broadcasting in various ways, what you will actually see and hear in the future. And very little indeed about international coverage, and yet at a time when international coverage is becoming ever more vital. And yet, both the main public broadcasters, the BBC and Channel 4, list as one of their primary purposes, and you only have to look at the reports, you only have to look at the handouts, they list as their primary purposes international coverage in various forms. You only have to look at ITV's and Channel 5's annual reports, and it's a shame neither of them are here tonight, you only have to look at ITV and Channel 5's annual reports to look how much they point to international coverage as being an important part of what they do, an important part of their public broadcasting remit. And then beyond that, we have the prospect of the digital age, of the internet, of mobiles, and all that that brings. So in this new world, can international coverage survive? Now, as well as having a distinguished panel, I can also see that we've got a distinguished audience with us tonight. I want you to contribute as much as you can, and you will, please. Ask these guys questions, ask them tough questions if you so feel about it. But let's just to get a feel of the audience, can I just start a quick poll, please? How many people in the audience tonight here are actively involved or have been actively involved in producing content, trying to get content on the air, and would describe themselves in some form or another as a producer? That's quite a lot. Yep, okay. And how many of you who've just put your hands up would describe yourselves as being involved in international content? Okay. And how many of those who just put your hand up would say that you have found it easy to get that international content onto the air?
A loaded question.
Not at all. Okay, all right. I hope to hear from some of you, those of you who have your hands up and those of you who don't have your hands up. Okay. What's the plan roughly? But if you're bursting to say something, please put your hand up. Please feel free to catch my eye. I'll ask some questions of the panel to start off with, and then later, obviously, we'll spread it out and ask amongst the panel. But if you hear something that you're really bursting to ask a question right from the word go, please do feel free to put your hand up and say. I'm just going to start with some very basic questions to our two commissioners. But first of all, let me introduce Clive Edwards, who is the BBC's executive editor and commissioning editor for television current affairs, on my far left. Let me also introduce Steve Barnett, doyen of media consultants, professor of communications at the University of Westminster, author of 2 reports on TV coverage of international affairs, and also, I believe, now an advisor to a Lord Select Committee. And on my right, Ed Braman, commissioning editor for news and current affairs at Channel 4, and amongst other things responsible for Unreported World, and I've met some of the Unreported World team here tonight, so I hope you will contribute too. Can I start off by asking our 2 commissioners, just for those of us who don't know, what do you do and what are you responsible for? Clive?
I'm, as Phil said, the Commissioner for Current Affairs, both indie and in-house at the BBC. We have an extraordinary range of programming across all 4 channels, and as you would expect me to say, and it's absolutely true, the BBC takes foreign affairs extremely seriously. And I think if you looked at the output we've got across those channels, you would agree too. I mean, on BBC One, Panorama currently has the most programmes it's ever had, 56 episodes a year, 48 half hours and 8 hours, of which last year a quarter were on foreign affairs subjects and in foreign affairs places. On BBC Two, the vast majority, I think it was 80% of the slate, is made up of foreign affairs programming of different kinds, chiefly This World, which has 10 single hours as the kind of flagship foreign affairs program. There's 6 hours of what we term travel journalism, which is like Tropic of Cancer, and which, to pick up the point in Phil's report, we distinguish from just travel TV, like Phil Merton going to China or wherever. There's a rather more serious purpose to it. And then lots of big series like Dimbleby in Russia, like Iran and the West. So I think BBC Two is pretty much foreign affairs. On BBC Three, there's another 16 hours of current affairs programming, of which there are some pretty surprising foreign affairs contributions coming up. A couple of programs on rape in the Congo and on the plight of women in Afghanistan, which for an audience of BBC Three's type, obviously appealing to younger people, is quite a departure. But you will have also seen, I'm sure, other doc series like Blood, Sweat and T-shirts, Blood, Sweat and Takeaways, and the recent Stacey Dooley Investigates that bring foreign affairs to a young audience in a completely different way, and I think are genuinely innovative and are reaching out to an audience that, frankly, otherwise would not be watching stories about globalization and other important foreign issues. And on BBC Four, a small amount of more intellectual, cerebral think pieces, but often still with some foreign content. So I think over the piece, the BBC really does take foreign affairs very seriously. And I've probably done my pitch. Over to you.
Yep, that's a pretty good, that's a pretty good pitch. Ed, what do you do and what are you responsible for?
Well, I'm part of a 4-person team at Channel 4 Commission News and Current Affairs. Dorothy Byrne, Tamara Abood, Kevin Sutcliffe and I are responsible collectively for Channel 4 News, for Dispatches, for Unreported World, which is my specific remit, and for the various specials that the Current Affairs Department produces. Following on from Clive's sort of list of basic ground, 40 dispatches a year currently, of which about a quarter are foreign. Unreported World, 20.5 hours a year. Channel 4 News, about 40 to 45% of it is foreign. And then there are also within Channel 4, of course, programmes that we don't make in current affairs, but we, which are clearly a commitment to foreign coverage, notably, true stories on More 4 and so on. So that's basically what I do, but my specific responsibility is Unreported World and the lion's share, but not by no means all, of Dispatch's foreign affairs projects, particularly the sort of what I like to describe as the heavy-duty ones, the ones where we spend a lot of time, particular levels of ambition, particular levels of danger or whatever. That's what I do.
Who decides what gets made?
In the sense of, well, collectively, really. I mean, it is a collegiate structure. In Unreported World, quite specifically, that's a discrete commission.
Yeah.
It's a trialogue between Siobhan Sillerton, who's the editor of the programme, myself, and Eamon Matthews, who runs the company and produces it. We sort of work that out together. And that's very much a discrete, separate agenda. It runs as a discrete unit. With Dispatches, it's much more of a sort of a collective view between the team, and a certain amount of input, obviously, from Kevin Ligo and Julian Bellamy. Kevin Ligo is our director of television, who is very committed to foreign affairs. Indeed, he was the guy who turned Unreported World from a discrete series of 5 a year or whatever into a sort of institution of 20 a year. And Julian Bellamy is the director, who's the sort of head of Channel 4. And what happens there is we will take a position on Afghanistan or Iraq or something like that, or you might guess what we might do when Slumdog Millionaire premieres on British television. That's where, that feeds in. But by and large, the decisions are made collectively on the basis of ideas that come in.
Who holds the budget? You hold the budget for Unreported World.
I hold the budget for Unreported World, and I hold some of the budget for Dispatches.
Who holds the rest of the budget?
Kevin Sutcliffe owns the rest of the budget for Dispatches.
And documentaries?
Documentaries, well, if it's true stories, it's held by Hamish and his team on More 4, and then and also Hamish outside of that, obviously Hamish Maikura. And then, of course, there's other foreign stuff, of course, we do, which crosses over in the same way that BBC 4 does into specialist factual, so that's Ralph Lee and so on. So there are a number of departments that also have foreign capacity, documentaries, specialist factual, even factual entertainment at times.
Who decides what gets made at the BBC, Clive?
Basically, the controllers have the final say. We take ideas to them that I think are worth doing for current affairs, and we decide theoretically together. It's a twin-tick system, but obviously the controllers have the ultimate power. But within that, there are all sorts, as you would expect, of BBC strategy, documents, policies, and targets we're aiming at that can affect something like foreign affairs.
There's no target for international coverage, am I right?
There's no specific target, no.
Would you welcome one?
I don't think one is necessary. I think the BBC is focused on that all the time. I mean, the whole news operation clearly prizes it with its operation around the world, and we absolutely prize it too. I think if I felt that it was slipping off the slate, then it would be immediately raised.
But you, apart from strands like Panorama, you don't hold the budget, the controllers hold the budget, is that right?
No, I hold the budget on the slate, so they take the money from me.
Right.
So that's why it's a twin tick.
Right. Okay. Bringing the world to the UK, which is one of the BBC's 6 primary purposes. For those of you who don't know, it was part of the Charter Agreement, and it's one of the BBC's 6 primary purposes. Bringing the world to the UK. In practical terms, as a commissioner, what does that mean to you?
It means obviously reporting everything of significance that is happening around the world, of significance to the audience, of significance generally. I mean, we are looking for, in those 10 This World's a year, doing the most significant stories. In Panorama, obviously, doing the frontline foreign stories, if you like, from Afghanistan, from Iraq. It's telling them what they need to know, and it's an important part of the BBC's mission to promote citizenship, to keep people informed, that they should know that. So we would expect a full range of the important stories. Because
one of the things that struck me when I wrote the report was I couldn't find anybody who said in the end they were responsible for the BBC's international coverage. There were a lot of people, such as yourself, doing very good work, but nobody seemed to be taking an overview of it.
Well, I think, as I said, it's so plumbed into the DNA of the BBC that everyone, from obviously Mark downwards, has it on their mind the whole time.
So it's everybody's responsibility.
So it's everybody's responsibility, and you know, every commissioner has programmes in that area pretty much. So I don't think you necessarily need, given how integral a part of the BBC it is, you necessarily need one person to keep an oversight. Okay.
Ed, what does challenge people to see the world differently, which Channel 4 has listed as one of its primary purposes in the new...
What does it mean?
What does it mean? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to you practically when you commission programmes and think about the sort of programmes you want to see made?
Well, the wellspring of that statement is fairly obvious. Channel 4 was set up for and has tried to be and has tried to continue to be an alternative way of looking at the world, to, if you like, question orthodoxies, look at ways of talking about places that other people wouldn't talk about, in ways that other people wouldn't talk about, finding stories that other people wouldn't talk about. So that's fairly straightforward as a principle. There are a whole number of ways of achieving that. One of them is actually, frankly, and forgive me because it'll come up a number of times, because I happen to have it sort of ingrained upon my heart, is what Unreported World does. There's a whole number of things that Unreported World does as a programme, and it's in there in the title, which subscribes absolutely to that sort of statement of principle. It does go to places that you will probably rarely, if ever, see reported anywhere on television. When was the last time you saw a report from Ingushetia? When did there be somebody who had the guts to go there? Well, we did, and the guy who did it is sitting right there. The way we tell those stories, we tell stories as a process of discovery in Unreported World, not as a process of an agenda that we've already written down before we've arrived there. So that's one particular way. Another particular way is just by sheer ambition, frankly. And that ambition can be, on the one hand, saying the Mumbai bombings are a big story. What can we say about the Mumbai bombings that nobody else is saying? And frankly, by sheer endeavour, by the production team, they came across fundamental evidence that nobody else had. It was extraordinary stuff. Frankly, if the BBC had got it, you would have been as proud of it as we were. We got to it first, and therefore we can say we gave the view that nobody else was talking about. So sometimes it's just about doing something first. In another example from recently, what it means to me, and it's a personal commission, and again, forgive me that people, you know, my private claque are sitting in this room, so forgive me. But we spent a year undercover, people spent a year undercover filming in Burma for us. Very few people would try something like that, would have the guts to try it. The people who did it were extraordinarily brave, and they produced a remarkable film. Now that is an alternative look at something. That isn't just a quick interview with Aung San Suu Kyi, if you can get it. No mean feat, by the way. But it was actually a very daring thing to do, which told us something which is hopefully important, hopefully original and a new take. Those are the sort of things it means to us. So it's different countries that other people wouldn't go to, frankly, stories that are not the frontline agenda. That's very much the BBC's frontline job, frankly, as a primary public service broadcaster. It's our job to tell the stories in different ways and to get to people who probably wouldn't otherwise speak. And I think fundamentally, more than anything else, I think this is where we do have a difference in the way, is that we believe fundamentally that we report from the ground up where we possibly can, rather from, if you like, the institution down. And I'm sure Clive would say that's what you do as well, but I think it's far more clear about Channel 4's coverage that we begin at the ground level as a first principle.
Steve, how's the nature of international coverage, the nature of what gets commissioned as documentaries, what's the overall tone and texture of international coverage changed in your view?
It's very difficult to separate that question from a question about is it the world that's changed, or is it the commissioning structure that's changed, or is it the funding that's changed?
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick you up on your very first question to the audience, which I thought was just a little bit disingenuous, because if you had a whole audience of comedy producers here, and you said to them, how many of you find it difficult to get your stuff on?
Yep.
They'd all be sticking their hands.
Yep.
Ditto children's producers. So I think the fact is it's quite hard to get stuff on television.
And it should be.
It should be. The question is, how hard should it be? And is it more difficult now than it used to be? Now, it's really interesting sitting here listening to Clive and to Ed, because I've part of my job is to try and make the link between what happens in policy terms and what happens on the television screens. And I keep trying to tell my students, just think about what you see and how that relates back. I still find it astonishing. Channel 4 is now over 25 years old. That we have here someone, I mean, obviously doing fantastic work, and Ed can talk in terms of the kinds of programs he makes. Doesn't have to talk in terms of ratings, doesn't have to talk in terms of bums on seats or money being earned, because of the structure that was set up to found Channel 4 over 25 years ago. The problem is, as Ed and probably a lot of you know, that is under threat. That's the problem. The system in which these guys work and in which you guys try and get your programs onto telly is gradually breaking down for all sorts of technological, economic and some political reasons. It's sort of beginning to crumble. And the real question for the future, I haven't answered your question at all. I'm answering a different question.
I'll ask you it again in a minute, don't worry.
The real question for the future is, how do we shore that system up to ensure that people like Clive and Ed and you can carry on making the programs that you make? Not because they're paternalistic or elitist or because you think people ought to know about them, but actually, as Phil's report I think brilliantly shows, that's actually what a lot of people want to see.
Okay, let me go back to the question. The question was, do you think the nature of international coverage, in particular international documentaries and longer programs, has changed over a period of time? We've got ITV and Channel 5, obviously.
Yeah. In terms of what's on, I actually think that what the BBC and Channel 4 do, the only change is change which has moved with the priorities of international events. Mm-hmm. And I think those are commissioning decisions, producer-led decisions. I think that's absolutely right. I quite like to ask them questions about their budget cuts, so that's a different issue.
I'm going to come on to money.
The elephant in the room, or rather the two elephants who aren't in the room, are Channel 5 and ITV. And I understand that they were asked, they wouldn't come. It's the second time I've done a gig here, actually. The last time was about the Press Complaints Commission, and they were asked and wouldn't come either. So there's obviously a forum where people feel slightly inhibited. But anyway, they wouldn't come, and I know why they wouldn't come. It's the same reason why when Michael Grade comes in front of the House of Lords Select Committee tomorrow morning, which he will do, he's going to be finding it very difficult to answer some of the questions about what is happening to non-entertainment programming on, quote, public service commercial television. And the answer is, it's actually disappearing. It's disappearing faster than the people who wouldn't come here this evening. And it is genuinely about money. It is partly about money. It is partly about them simply not earning the cash to be able to fund programs that aren't going to put millions of bums on seats, maybe 2 million instead of 6 million. That's a big gap if you're a commercial broadcaster. It's partly about the regulatory will, Ofcom not being prepared to kick them up the backside and tell them you will do that. And it's partly about the political will as well. That governments, in a way, of all political colour, have given up the ghost on commercial public service funding. And what we're being left with is the BBC and Channel 4.
There's a lot of people standing at the back. If you would like to come and take some seats, please do. There are plenty of seats down the front. And talking of bums on seats, can I talk about audiences? Mm-hmm. It's said that, or it's often widely reported that, international programs get lower audiences than stories on domestic subjects. Is this true?
Depends what kind of program it is, doesn't it? I mean, a recent This World, Gypsy Child Thieves, which was a truly amazing piece of both undercover and observational work, got 2 million on BBC Two. Paul Kenyon just did a two-parter on the trail of economic migrants across North Africa into Europe, and the first part for Panorama got 2.8, the second part 2.4. That seemed to be pretty good figures. Of course it is tougher to get an audience because it's about something that's not immediately to do with people's lives, with what drives them from day to day. But the challenge is to find the subjects that will engage them and make them come regardless, and that's what we try and do all the time.
You're a commercial organisation. You've got to sell. You're a public commercial organisation. You've got to sell advertising. Audience figures?
We don't do brilliantly on foreign affairs stories. It would be naive of me to suggest that we do. Unreported World gets something between 600, 700 and 1.2 million at 7:30 on a Friday. Some of our foreign affairs programmes, if they play at 8 o'clock in dispatches, they will get between 1.5 or 2 million, best. If they play at 9 o'clock, it's considerably better than that. It would be slightly... one thing I will say, however, and I want to sort of be clear about this, is that while Channel 4 is a commercial organisation, there is no question, there has never ever been, and this is absolutely unequivocally true, nobody's ever come up to me, Andy Barnes, the Director of Sales, has never said, couldn't you do tits in Marbella instead on Unreported World? And I mean that. I mean, nobody's said that. I mean, there isn't that sort of pressure. But the truth is that, by and large, foreign affairs do not do as well as stuff which happens in people's backyards. And it's significant that the things that do tend to do better have sort of to do with something else somehow. You know, children are a universal subject wherever they are. Little babies, particularly, are a universal subject. And so Africa's Witch Children, on that basis, like your Gypsy programme, will do well, because it's not about the country they're in, it's about cuddly subjects, frankly. Similarly, undercovers tend to do well because people enjoy the vicariousness of them wherever they are. You know, obviously they like to see sort of local hoodlums being, you know, brought down, or builders, but frankly undercovers tend to do rather well. So sometimes it's not the foreign coverage then I say watching, it's a response to almost the format or more fundamental casting decisions. And I would suggest that you know if you did sort of gypsy, you know, if you did kidnappers or baby barterers in Laos, if you had undercover footage, you'd probably do equally well if you had a very nice, attractive shot in the masthead of The Guardian.
There's another issue here about audiences, which is, I think, universally, foreign programmes get lower audiences than domestic programmes. That's just a fact of life. That's not a problem. Now look at those audiences in absolute terms. Channel 4 News, which, and I think you underestimated actually the level of international programming, because I've done some research on this. It has kept at around 50% from the very beginning.
We use the figure 40-43, but fair enough. Okay.
It's certainly around 50%.
I'll take 50, it's all right.
You think of that. You go to America and try to explain to Americans that we have an entirely commercially funded channel which will run a 1-hour news bulletin in the heart of peak time, of which 50% is international television, international stories. And they will look at you as if you start raving mad. 1 million, most broadsheet newspapers would be quite happy with a daily sale of 1 million people. So if you take away the television context, where we're still used to talking in terms of 5 or 6 million people as a healthy audience, 1 million, I reckon, is still pretty damn good. 1 million people exposed to the kinds of issues that they don't normally talk about, they're not normally interested in, they don't normally see or read about.
But I mean, you know, all of that is heartening. You know, but the fact of the matter is, if I'm sitting there at Horseferry Road and I see a programme coming in where people have done remarkable things, you know, they spent 3 weeks up the Amazon trying to get to a story which has been tough, or they've had rocks thrown at them, you know, somewhere unpleasant in the world, or shots fired, and they've worked really hard to bring a story home about something that matters, it galls me that only 600,000 people want to see that, despite everything we do.
That's how I feel when I write articles.
But,
more people read
you know, and I think that tension is important to bring out. Not because I say watch the person, not the show, but the fact that these stories matter enough that people, use a lot of guts to get them, and I think people should realise that. Sorry.
Yep. Somebody in the audience, do you want to say who you are?
I'm Sally Ann Wilson. I run the broadcast media scheme, the CBA Diffie Broadcast Media Scheme, and I'm one of the editors and commissioners of a piece of work called The World in Focus, which was published in June this year, where we commissioned audience research. And it's really that research and previous research we've done that causes me to question a couple of words that are being used, particularly foreign, and this sense that, and there's some fantastic work being done, Channel 4, BBC in particular, but this idea of what's relevant to us here in the UK, because when we ask audiences, or when our researchers ask audiences, they no longer live their lives in quite such distinct domestic international boxes as I think both Clive and Ed, to a certain extent, perceive them. When we talk about what's relevant to us here, there's still this sense of it's something foreign happening out there, something different. And we can only really, particularly with Clive, you know, we're talking about the frontline issues, whereas audiences are saying, we want to know how ordinary people live their lives in other parts of the world. We want more context, not just the frontline issues. So it's not really a criticism. It's just saying, where are we going to get those stories and more stories that aren't just the hard-hitting frontline news stories, but the context and background to everyday lives lived elsewhere?
Yeah, just let me clarify the word frontline. For me, frontline doesn't literally mean in the war zone. Frontline is about the most important issues, the ones that, if you like, you can define as changing the world, making the world different, you know, the important ones. I think we're always trying to bring an insight into how people live their lives, but at the end of the day, you know, people are going to sit down to Foreign Affairs because they think both that it engages with something they're interested in, but that it is important too. And documentaries, I mean, I don't personally speak for docs. Obviously, docs do a good job as well of getting out there and seeing how the rest of the world lives. So perhaps I was just summing up my own corner of the BBC's foreign empire, but there's a hell of a lot of other stuff out there that will engage with just literally how people live.
But what are you looking for in international ideas? I mean, is it fair, as some people said to me, and put your BBC-wide hat on for a moment, that it has to have a big name attached to it in order to get a fair chance of the controller saying yes to it? It has to have a Stephen Fry figure, or it has to have that sort of name attached to it?
Personally, in current affairs, we don't engage particularly with the celebrity presenter, but we have, if you like, our own version of that. So recently we did the future of food on global food sustainability and had George Alagaya. Undoubtedly, those kind of people bring a profile to the series, and therefore we hope an audience to it. And I make no apology for that, because the content remains absolutely serious and important. And it's not like we've simply imported Philip Merton, and well, Paul Merton, Philip.
Besides, you all understand something quite fundamental about this, is that, you know, there is, I mean, I'll come back to your point in a minute, because I think that, you know, I think there's something I want to say about that. But on this whole sort of idea of the celebrity lead, because, I mean, Channel 4's been accused of that as much as anybody else. You know, the fact of the matter is, if you employ a celebrity to do something like this, you're outside the fundamental domain of news and current affairs. Not because it's a celebrity, but because, in a sense, they are already committed in some way or other. Now, the first job of news and current affairs in our public service tradition, which is a very important, holy position, is fairness and balance and impartiality and clarity and rationality. And all those things are arguably mitigated against the moment you have a celebrity. So, in a sense, and believe it or not, all the controllers understand that. I'm sure Jay Hunt understands that. I'm sure Janice understands that. Kevin Ligo and Julian understand that. So they're not going to say, by the way, Unreported World will be much better if you got, I don't know, Jordan to do it. You know, don't leave that for a moment.
But what about Michael Palin? I mean, he doesn't come with baggage.
No, but Michael Palin wasn't making a sort of a current affairs project. He was making, when he first came on, he was the second choice for Around the World in 80 Days. And what he did was he made it his own in a very particular style. And in a strange sort of way, at the time that happened, I agree with you. You know, he's clearly, you know, extremely bright, extremely well-informed, inquisitive, and all those things. What he did was he created a subject, a way of approaching things all of his own. People now commission a Michael Palin series as a consequence of that. So I don't think that contradicts the case. I think the case Phil was making was the argument that now, in these more straightened times, when Palin first emerged, 15, 16 years ago, Around the World in 80 Days, some considerable time ago, but in these more straightened times, to get something about a country that begins with Z on screen, you'd have to have a celebrity to do it. And I don't think actually that enters anybody's head, especially when it comes to doing something serious about those places.
So you're not going to be commissioning Katie Price's Rwanda anytime soon?
But having said all that, I mean, credit where credit's due, and one has to be, you know, we can't be sort of dog in the manger about these things. A lot of us have looked at, you know, Ross Kemp's work on Sky, you know, and his particular take on Afghanistan and particular way of bringing that story home. And yes, we envy it. We envy the fact that it's created notice. It's forged a link with a particular constituency in relation to that war and military matters. Like that. I think his work on gangs was slightly more meretricious. I have to say that. But I think, you know, some of the stuff he's done, and you know, so you know, it can work. But you actually are spending most of your time watching Ross Kemp, frankly.
But is there an element of elitism there? If you come back to this question about, which I think is really interesting, what people want to relate to what's going on in other parts, it's a sort of from our own correspondent on television, which is a great idea. It seems to me that getting some kind of celebrity, not someone like Jordan, but someone,
sorry,
okay, but someone who isn't going to distract quite so much from the viewing experience, to make it more accessible, to bring people into that kind of programme, will actually serve that purpose.
Well, I debate that, but...
Well, I think there are two different types of programmes, though. If you're after trying to discover and get an insight into how people live, I think it's perfectly reasonable that you might get that from Stephen Fry around America, from Paul Merton,
or
China,
Jerry Halliwell when she did those
all
programmes.
the rest of them.
Yeah.
But if you want proper, you know, analysis and all the rest of it, you get that as well. I think it's a very broad range.
I'm sorry. If you're bringing the world to the UK, there are different ways of doing it. I worry about the notion that you can't do it seriously if you have a celebrity. There are different kinds of celebrities.
Well, but as I said originally, if you look at the BBC Three stuff and Stacey Dooley Investigates, is a good example, which was on last week. There's a young woman, really feisty young woman, who first appeared in Blood, Sweat and T-shirts, and her vision of the world and her way is really engaging. It's certainly not proper in that sense, but it's bringing in a completely different audience. So I'm not saying there's only one way of doing it. I'm saying there's lots of ways of doing it. Sorry, proper was just the shorthand for the very, very serious stuff.
But does having a figure like Bruce Parry help, as opposed to having just a conventional sort of, to use another pejorative phrase, look at life documentary about Amazon tribes?
Well, it engages the audience. He's a colourful character.
Yeah.
You know, in the panorama of all the different things we do.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if it's elitist to say that I wouldn't want Bruce Parry sitting down with Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia to interrogate him about his policy on Somalia, I think I'd probably be justified, wouldn't I? And if that's elitist, forgive me.
Yes, please.
Yes, hello. I come from Ecuador. I'm a Latin American journalist in UK. I just finished a master's degree in media management at the University of Westminster. I have here what you have talked today, and I have taken some notes. And basically, you talk a lot about the future of the international coverage, the knowledge about the world affairs, can international media survive in globalization, and to bring the foreign affairs to UK taken serious and significant. But all the year I have been here, the balance of international news in your media industry is not equal with what you're talking about, globalized and foreign affairs in the whole world. Basically, the content I have seen is just a good criticism, I think. It's about this part of the world. Why you haven't think of a solution as a solution to open your scope to another type of contents that are not basically about what happens in this other part of the world and not, for example, 22 countries in Latin America. There are many important contents and issues that happens, for example, about the FARC, and it's not only about Colombia, Hugo Chavez, and Brazil's football. So I think where is the balance? Where is the balance about saying that take foreign affairs very seriously and that you bring the world to UK? So I just have that question. Why you haven't think about open your scope?
Just to supplement that, if I may, if those of you who have seen the report may have noticed that we did a map of where coverage and where gets covered. And as you will have probably noticed, South America not quite disappears off the world, but certainly gets very, very squeezed.
I think in response to that, I mean, Sir Vaughan Sillitoe in its Unreported World, we're sitting there remembering a mantra of mine every time we discuss stories, which goes along the lines of, you've forgotten Central and South America, which is no disrespect. And because of that, I know, but because of, yeah, and Portuguese. But because we keep on saying that, we do it, and I actually resist the idea that, first of all, as coverage, it's coverage of South America, if that's what you're saying, for example, South America, is incredibly high. Not least because where does Bruce Parry spend most of his time? I mean, quite seriously. Unreported World, at least, I mean, about 3 stories in every 20 is a South American or a Central American story. We've got one coming up in 2 weeks' time. So that would be. So I'm not quite sure where you say the broadening the scope. If your point is broadening the scope, and it's that we don't do Spanish-speaking, it's Portuguese-speaking South America, I repudiate the suggestion. If I think there is something we find more difficult about covering South America and Central America, I would agree with that, and partly it's because there's a precondition that says places like Sao Paulo and various other places are extremely violent, so let's do the gangs. If we can't do the gangs, let's do the drugs. If we can't do the drugs, let's do the former Nazi dictators sort of story. But it is rather more difficult to deal with them. It's true. But I would repudiate the suggestion we don't try and deal with the difficulty. I can go into why it's difficult, and but anyway.
I would say the same thing. I mean, Panorama has done a number of stories on South America fairly recently, including one, inevitably enough, on the rainforest. We had a whole series called Explore, of which one was set in Argentina, that brought an audience to a number of different current affairs stories throughout the country in a kind of travel journalism way, but nevertheless there was a spin-off on the dispossessed in Buenos Aires. So we do take these things seriously. But I would also say it's just a bit harder, to be honest, and we historically probably haven't looked in that direction. I'm not talking of the BBC, I'm talking about the British in quite the same way as other countries in Europe that clearly have closer links. Yeah. So there's a sort of slight inevitability that we're not looking there so often, but it's not, there's no question we do it. But
the quite marked geopolitical drift in South America in particular towards the left, Chavez, Morales, Lula, and so on, is something that we've picked up on, particularly, Unreported World and on Channel 4 News, because it is of geopolitical significance, and not just because Hugo Chavez spends most of his time talking to Fidel Castro, a successor, or President Ahmadinejad. These are important developments within the sort of geopolitical, in geopolitics. So we have done those things. So where we have found a point of access which is both legitimate within the context of a foreign story, as it were, but also with resonance, we have done that. So your point about Colombia isn't just about FARC. Yeah, we know Colombia isn't just about FARC.
I think, can I just say one thing, Phil? I think this raises a question that we haven't actually addressed so far, which is there is a distinction between current affairs and everyday news journalism. And to some extent, the news agenda is going to be driven by where the news bureau are and where the reporters on the ground are. So I think actually the current affairs programs have got a pretty good record in looking around the world, despite this sort of distended map that Phil's produced. I'm less convinced about our news programs, with the possible exception of Channel 4 News, but that can be proven one way or the other. But there is an issue about where your news bureau are, where your reporters are, and the increasing tendency to pull out permanent news bureau and to have sort of parachuted journos, sort of going in for a particular story or at a particular time.
Okay, I've got a lot of hands going up now. Yes, please, at the back there.
John Owen. I'd like to challenge that, actually, and also a question for Clive Edwards. You talk about the outpouring of international affairs programs, but how can it be that the BBC, either on 1 or 2, does not have a weekly, regularly scheduled international affairs program in the tradition, I'm looking at Juliana Rufus from Al Jazeera English, in the tradition of Witness or People in Power, or in the tradition in the past of Correspondent, or something akin to that. There simply is not a regularly scheduled international affairs program on either BBC One or 2, and This World. I defy anyone to try and tell you when This World is scheduled. You simply can't find it. So I think, in fact, all of this huge firepower from these bureaus and from current affairs, and if you wander around BBC at all, it is a grumble that you hear incessantly from high-powered international correspondents that can't get material on the air in long form.
Okay, well, I just simply say Panorama actually is on every week and is an international program.
It's not international.
In terms of This World, it's become a number of one-off documentaries because the BBC a few years ago decided to go for what is described as fewer, bigger, better, to concentrate its money in these troubled economic times for the BBC on making sure that we have big programs with big impact. So there has been, in some sense, a lessening of the number of programs, undoubtedly, because at one stage This World had half hours and did run in more obviously a Strand kind of way. But nevertheless, there are still, as I've already described at some length, quite a lot of coverage. Plus, if you're comparing us to Al Jazeera, and that's fine, there's also clearly the news channel, which has a number of programs dedicated to foreign coverage every week. So I think, look at the whole output of the BBC, and we're not exactly letting people down on this.
But am I right in saying that when you started Witness, the number of This World episodes was cut to 10, is that correct?
Sorry, Witness?
Sorry,
that was going back a way.
No, sorry, the new programme you commissioned, the multi-item...
Explore.
Sorry, Explore.
No, well, Explore was part of the travel journalism. It simply alternated with Simon Reeve's Tropic of
And did the number of This World, did the number of This Worlds...
The number of This Worlds
reduce
went down a couple. It's coming back up this year.
Okay.
And in fact, I've just, in the last few weeks, had a meeting with Janice and with Janice Hadlow and with George Entwistle, committing to more of the This Worlds being in peak, in very peak, in 9 o'clock. So, you know, we're constantly reviewing this. We do appreciate the need.
Just picking up on John's point, you could actually take one or two of those programs on the news channel, put them on mainstream television.
Well, you could.
They're there, you don't have to pay for them. You could just
Sure, you could. The reality is they would run very, very late at night because there is just enormous competition for the main slots on BBC One and 2.
I mean, we have to... Sorry, I just want to make one point in defence of my old friend and colleague here, and it is quite an important one, is we do... the straitened times in which we live are not just financially straitened. The level of competition we now just face of people's eyeballs is huge. And that can be anything from sophisticated audiences who might otherwise watch foreign affairs, who also like watching reruns of The West Wing, or upmarket American drama, or The Wire. Now, once you're in that sort of league, if you're running a mainstream terrestrial channel, a BBC One, a BBC Two, a Channel 4, even an ITV and Channel 5, God help us, what you're dealing with is you're trying to attract an incredibly difficult-to-find audience to a range of programmes. They have a right to expect us to put our best wares on show, not just shows which we'll do some foreign affairs, which we found somewhere else, which is done more cheaply. That on those mainstream channels, they have a right to expect the very, very best, because this is difficult airtime for them to devote themselves to. And we have to recognise that. And a lot of people, the look on your face suggests that you don't think that's the case, but it is. Because you may be a maven for these things, but a lot of people who are serious about their television, serious about the world, are also serious about the choices they make with their leisure time and these things. We have to compete. And if that means we have to put on the very best and the most distinctive and the best and fight to get it on, that seems to be perfectly reasonable in these Darwinian times. I'm sorry.
Okay, I've got 9 hands to get through. Do you want to come back on that?
That's not provocative. I don't know what is.
Well, one channel is still fighting those under the air. BBC with 2 channels is excluding a regularly scheduled international affairs program.
Okay, here, please.
Yes, Valerie Toot, I'm an ex-BBC World Service and now a foreign correspondent. I would like to debate your point and saying that I have the feeling that if it's not exotic, if it's not outside Europe, that it doesn't have a chance. And I would like to say that I personally think that the European coverage of the BBC, and I speak mostly of the BBC here, has got gradually worse and worse. And I think, and I don't know whether we can talk about news programs, I know it's a totally different matter, But if we look
Talk about anything you want to talk about.
Look at the 6 o'clock news. You know, very often you have a feeling that it's more crime watch than a serious news bulletin. You know, well, I'm sorry, I might be totally partial because I'm from Europe. What happened to Europe? Where is Europe? You know, and to imagine that you can cover Europe from Brussels, it's frankly ridiculous. And I think that maybe we could have a look at whether there is a connection in the sort of instinctively anti-European feelings and the fact that there is hardly anything gets covered apart from, you know, obviously big institutional events. Well, I was at the weekend over at Dublin, and I was really, it struck me how little coverage there is apart from the sort of bureaucratic approach.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. Can you pass the microphone across to the lady in red there? I'm just going to gather some points and sort of, yep, see what we can. Yep.
Valerie, you might remember, my name's Rosie Goldsmith, and 20 years ago at the BBC we started a radio programme called Europhile. It started 2 days after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I'm surprised actually that Clive doesn't remember that Crossing Continents, which is possibly also an inspiration for your programme, but...
well, no, but anyway, carry on, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
almost, but I know that we, at some point, we have had conversations. But I've been a reporter for 20 years for radio, current affairs, foreign affairs. We used to cover Europe much more. We went on to become Crossing Continents. And really, I suppose I want to know where radio fits into this whole thing. In radio, we're being pushed more and more to become like television. In fact, we take video cameras with us. We do picture galleries. We do web, online reports all the time. We are being encouraged to be more televisual, which I don't mind personally. I mean, I rather enjoy all that. But, you know, we're not stars, we're not celebrities. We're expert specialists in foreign affairs. We still cover regularly on Crossing Continents difficult parts of the world, cultural stories, social stories. They're less wanted these days, unfortunately, but and we're being encouraged more and more to go to Afghanistan, Iraq, and difficult places because they are easier to commission because we can do them for television and online as well. There's nothing anymore, just, you know, there's no more radio programs, pure radio programs.
Can you pass the microphone across to the woman in the pink cardigan? Yep.
Yes, I'm Juliana Rufus from Al Jazeera. I'm interested, we're talking about the past and we're talking about what's being commissioned at the moment, but I'm actually quite interested in how you're preparing for changes. Are you considering that the internet and getting hits on the internet for programs that you've commissioned is a big thing? You know, we're talking about the big switch off. What do you think the future for current affairs programming is? Because there's a lot of talk about how news is going to survive. There are alternative funding models for documentaries, but current affairs sits bang in the middle, and I'd like to know how you at the BBC and Channel 4 prepare for that.
Right, Clive, can I ask you to address the question about the 6 o'clock news? Is it just an edition of Crime Watch? Is the coverage of Europe rubbish? And could you talk also a little bit about the future and budgets?
Right. One-word answers, please.
I can't run it over, isn't it?
In the next 90 seconds.
Okay, the 6 o'clock undoubtedly has become, intentionally so, more friendly for the British viewer and more about the British viewer's interests, because at that time of night, that is the audience sitting down to watch television. They are, I think you have to see the whole panoply of what the BBC does. To isolate the 6 from the incredible foreign coverage on the 10 seems to me to miss the point. Yeah. If you are interested in foreign coverage, I don't think it's too much to ask you to watch the 10 more often than you do the 6. But equally, if you're a family at home at tea time with the kids, the 6 might tell you about the things in the world that you're interested in. And that seems to be satisfying your audience in a perfectly straightforward way. Sorry, I've forgotten the second one. Europe.
Thank you.
I think it's ironical to be criticised for not covering Europe enough, because normally we're criticised for not getting outside Europe. In fact, the BBC takes Europe incredibly seriously. It is one of the subjects that is currently audited. Every single bit of output about Europe gets logged and put down and reported to the Trust. So I really do think we are taking it seriously. I perfectly accept that you might think we should perhaps do even more of it, and taking up the point about radio. Apologies for not having said anything about radio. I'm afraid I'm a TV beast, but I do recognise the the immense actual foreign coverage on radio, and you didn't mention from our own correspondent as well, you know, it's all part of the piece. The BBC is so dedicated to it across all its different outlets. So, you know, that's all I can say. I'm repeating myself. Doesn't he get to do something?
Yep, the future.
The future. Well,
okay, you should take the future.
Okay.
I thought you were going to do it.
As you know, I mean, as many of you know, Channel 4 is actually going through a process at the moment which we call creative renewal. Some might call it, what do we do after Big Brother? But let's call it creative renewal. But this, I joke slightly, but it's a very serious exercise, because one of the jobs Channel 4 has to do is, and indeed any broadcaster that's actually seriously committed to being a cultural force as opposed to a mover of product, is that you have to continually examine what you're doing. So we're going through a major examination at the moment, from which I can say with confidence current affairs will emerge as strong, possibly even stronger. But with regard to Julie Anna's point, there's a very, I think it's quite notable that when the grown-up broadcasters and big money has started to play into the sort of global television market, one of the things they've invested in first and foremost, whether it's, you know, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, or whether it's the BBC, or, you know, is in international news, BBC World, things like that. And I think that there's a lot that's said about how dreadful it's going to be once the audience anatomizes and disappears onto the web and everybody's watching reruns of The Wire in 25 years' time on their portable PlayStations. Actually, I think there is some strong evidence to say that, in a strange sort of way, international programming of all the programs that Britain makes, alongside, you know, numerous adaptations of Jane Austen novels, is one of the things that people consistently tune into. And the evidence I have for that, and Eamon will back me up this, Eamon Matthews, is that when Unreported World is, God forbid, pirated onto YouTube, thousands, if not millions, of hits. People want to see these programs. Very often, people want to see them because they're in countries that can't see about their own country. And what this tells me, actually, is if you get away from the panic about the future, that everything's going to go onto the web, and oh my God, what's the next skin going to be on the iPlayer, and is it going to be pink or not, and am I going to be always watching my iPod? And they actually would think about the most fundamental question: what is the content that people really want to see? Because the web isn't about, web's a technology. If it's not, hasn't got content, it's pointless. And if you look at the stuff people want to see, even while our audience in Britain may be declining, and God forbid, yes it is, the audience around the rest of the world is not. There are audiences in Burma who, if they can lay hands on YouTube, will want to see what we're saying about Burma. And one of the reasons they're doing that is because they trust the Brits, and they trust the BBC's reputation, and we lig off the BBC's reputation in this respect, to be fair, balanced, thoughtful, intelligent and incisive. It is worth, if you're serious about the world you live in, finding it. So in a peculiar way, all the indications are, probably contrary to the orthodoxies, all the indications is that the world out there and these new distribution systems favour what we're talking about in these rooms. Because you don't always need the subtitles, but most of all, here's somebody probably taking you into an account of the country you live in that you'll never get. You can bet your bottom dollar, if you're in Kinshasa at the moment, nobody is talking about rape in Eastern Congo.
You know, that's actually partly my question. Could there be a point where, if you're really seriously thinking about your survival, where you're moving away from maybe commissioning wholly for domestic audiences by also thinking about international audiences? You
commission for the audience you know, and you commission for the beliefs you have and the values you have, and those values will translate. If you try and think your way into somebody else's culture and their assumptions, you can't.
But you're not. You just said people will watch you because you're free, balanced and fair.
Yeah, they balance because of what we are, what we do and what we do well. And that may sound sanctimonious, and forgive me if it does.
I'm with you. I mean, I think that's one of the great things.
I'd rather do that than try and pretend that I was, you know, that I knew what the world looked at from VNTN. I don't.
I think there is still a problem of money, and I'm interested to hear you say, Ed, that you are confident that the current affairs will stay as it is on Channel 4. I have to say I'm less confident. News, I think, is at the core of the Channel 4 offer. Let's remember that if we believe what the Channel 4 Chief Executive has been saying the last 2 years, and what Ofcom, the regulator, has agreed after several, God knows how many audits, Channel 4 is facing a deficit of between 100 and 150 million pounds a year as of next year or 2 years onwards. Something has got to give. If it's not current affairs, then it'll be original drama, or it'll be innovative comedy, or it'll be something else. And I worry. I worry about the future of Channel 4. I think there are certain things that are sacrosanct. Dorothy Byrne made it perfectly clear that news was one of them. I'm afraid I think current affairs is going to suffer.
Do you think about a new business model?
Just hold, that's a big thought. Can you just hold that one, and can I take the question in the corner there, please?
Yeah, my name's Chris Mitchell. I run a production company called ORTV, which does only international affairs, although less and less of it is actually commissioned by broadcasters in this country. There's so many questions being begged tonight, it's hard to know where to start, but I mean, just in passing, I'd say that...
Try some.
Just a couple. The last time I worked for This World, I was working for it in 2005. It was running 24 or 28 shows a year, all at 9 o'clock prime time. So we've seen a really drastic decline over the last 4 years. There's absolutely no avoiding that.
You're not that convinced by his taking it up from 10 to 12?
I'm not. I mean, it's small potatoes because it has no identity as a regular strand. I mean, it's great that it exists, of course, we celebrate that. But, you know, it doesn't have the presence that it used to have. I also appreciate what Ed said a moment ago about the pressure on the competitive pressure on different channels of everybody trying to get their shows on. The problem is that those are the only channels which are going to take our kind of work. You know, that's the problem. It's not like we can look to ITV3, you know, or any of the other marginal digital channels to take the sort of work that we do. But my question is actually to you, Phil, and it's this, and these are words I never thought I'd hear drop from my lips. It's a question about methodology. I wonder if in your report you have aggregated basically everything which is foreign in the way that you put your numbers together. I haven't had a chance to go through it minutely, but are you including in the hours of broadcast things like natural history, like holiday programs, like what you might call soft international coverage? Or have you done any sort of more refined breakdown of the programs? And if you have, what is the result that you found in terms of the sort of work that we're talking about amongst this audience, which makes sense in terms of international coverage to us?
The numbers came from the respective International Broadcast Trust reports, which Steve was involved with, and has been a series of reports over dating back to the 1990s, where they've tracked the number of hours of coverage. They are hours of coverage of non-news factual programs.
You make I mean, let's not go into the details of the methodology now, but you make a very, very good point, which is how do you distinguish between a serious, informative, stroke educational international program and essentially a travel log? And it's difficult, is the answer. We've tried to do it. The most recent study, which I didn't do, adopted a slightly different methodology. But there are value judgments involved, and it's not easy. And
certainly one of the things I came across was that certainly when it came to Africa, a lot of what we were counting as African programming, of course, was wildlife programming. And I think there are, you know, that's why I raised some of the big questions about the nature of the coverage of Africa. There is coverage of Africa, but what picture do you get of Africa from what you see? It's either disasters or lions, but
figures end up being profoundly misleading about the kind of stuff that we're really talking about.
Well, I think the answer is you read the footnotes. One of which, one of my early reports said, beware. The 95% of the hours of ITV's international programming was "I'm a celebrity, get me out of here" in Fiji.
Yeah, which was, you know, and there are always things about categories.
But I think you should also recognise that the types of programming are changing, and we're all borrowing each other's coats in order to try and appeal to the audience. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the fundamental purpose is any less serious or is not getting across. And I come back to the Tropic of Cancer series with Simon Reeve. There you have an engaging character who gets in a different audience who would never watch Panorama, never watch This World in a month of Sunday, but can nevertheless be brought to the sort of stories that you would never get on television otherwise, whether it's on the Pampas, whether it's the Dispossessed, or whatever it is. So there are lots of different ways of still having that purpose.
I think we have to accept that foreign coverage begins with a trip to an airport or a moment you put a backpack on. I have to accept that out of a celebrity, get me out of here doesn't really constitute anything, doesn't even tell you about it. It's set in Australia. You'd be hard-pressed to know, wouldn't you?
Please.
My question has been partially answered, but I was surprised because I came here and it was an event on the digital age and we didn't hear much about the web. But I was going to address it more specifically, maybe in terms of the business model as well, in the sense of, for example, Unreported World. Why doesn't, and I might be mistaken, but why doesn't it have a website?
It does.
It does?
Yeah.
Okay, well, then. But for example...
It has a website as part of the Channel 4 branded website.
Exactly, that's what I thought. Because I remember trying to download 4 on demand on my Mac, and I couldn't do it because it wasn't...
At that time, it probably wasn't compatible
with my
now.
operating system, which is Snow Leopard. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I was trying to watch it, and it was virtually impossible. And so I resorted to YouTube, and it was downloaded in 5 parts. And I was thinking, okay, maybe I'm a child of the digital age, but everyone is constantly glued to their seats in front of the computer. And why is it that they can't download things on iTunes, for example, and watch it from there? Because the audience now is on the internet exclusively. I don't watch TV anymore, unfortunately.
Wow.
And I'm a journalist, and I've worked. I did an internship at Unreported World. I'm passionate about it, but I couldn't do it, and there's many people like me.
Well, Steve, is that true? Is that true? The audience for television is dead. It's all on the internet now.
Not everyone, not the audience, but it's going in that direction.
The impression that you're giving is simply wrong. I mean, I entirely accept that for a few people out there, they do nothing but watch on their computers. They are very, very rare. Less than 1% of total viewing is online, and there's been research done over the Atlantic. There's been research done over here. Qualitative work in people's houses, watching the way people interact. These are new homes which have got every mod con in terms of digital appliances. The amount of communal viewing on living room sets is going up, not down. And the amount of ordinary watching linear television in real time is running at something like 90 to 95%. That might go down a bit over time, but let's not exaggerate the impact of interactivity.
I understand your point and I appreciate it, but what my point is that it's moving in that direction.
Very, very slowly, and and that is not the future.
So it's not part of the business plan?
That's a separate question.
That's a different question.
The BBC has obviously spent enormous amounts in getting us ready for the digital age in online and controversially in the online service as well. So we're absolutely posed for the future, but frankly, I think there will still always be an audience that wants to watch straightforward television.
And the business plan issue is a complicated one. It boils down to a very simple thing at the moment. At the moment, the BBC is the recipient of a licence fee. It has a first and fundamental duty to supply its programming free. Channel 4, in a way, because of its particular funding mechanism, we aren't required to make a profit. We don't pay for our transmitters. We therefore effectively get a dividend for a public service dividend. We therefore cannot charge either. We are a public service broadcaster. Now, it may well be, inevitably, that for both the BBC and us, the economic circumstances will change, and then at that time we will have to, a horrible word, monetize, turn a lot of what we produce into ways of generating income, and then what may well be getting rid of geo-blocking on various forms of programming and so on, if the licenses can stand it. But let's not confuse the argument about the business model, which is a complex and difficult one, with the fundamental proposition, which is how do we get our programs out there. And at the moment, both Clive and I effectively work for organisations who are obliged to hand them out, who offer programming free, because that's how we're constituted.
All the panellists said to me before we started tonight, how are we going to keep going for that long? There won't be, and I've got 9 questions I still haven't taken. Yeah, at the back, please.
Mick Charkey, documentary filmmaker, not a news waller, not really a current affairs waller, although I do like standing back and looking, maybe 5 years into the past, but certainly not today. I think we're actually well served or overloaded with news, information, not a lot of explanation, not a lot of interpretation, not a lot of context. But if I may, I'll put that aside, because that's rather a judgmental position. I feel very shortchanged tonight. I thought we would have a documentary representative here. I'm a huge believer in the power of a documentary, not mediated by the obvious people, the Christopher Fry, the Michael Palins, Paul Mertens. I think there's a real need for human stories with characters from abroad that could really tell the world about the world. And I've done 200 or 300 of them. I've found them enormously commercial. I've found they've sold all over the world. The BBC only has to put up 25% at the most. Germany, France, Japan, America can find the rest. And these stories sell and sell. And I think there's an extraordinary lack of opportunities for ordinary people to see ordinary people. Ordinary people in a context that tells us more about ourselves, but obviously tells us about them too. Where are they? Where have they gone? And I don't think any of you probably can answer this. I wish there was a documentary person, perhaps from the BBC.
Well, Charlotte Moore was supposed to be here as commissioning editor for documentaries, but I think the BBC, in their wisdom, decided that Clive would handle everything. So please ask him about documentaries.
I'd like to make one reply to you, and I mentioned it earlier. I mean, our strand's True Stories. Admittedly, it runs on More 4, apart, you know, but that's funded in precisely the way you described.
No, Afghan Star was brilliant, but they're very lost.
Well, I mean, we make there's 40-odd true stories a year, the majority of which are international stories, most of which are made by, fairly important author documentary makers. I mean, Michael Winterbottom, for God's sake, making one is no small beer, and they're funded in precisely the way you say it.
There's always a good way of coming back on that sort of question, but in the mainstream, at times of day when most people watch television on channels that are easy to get, there seems to be a real shortage. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. I think all I'd say is, This World is a documentary series, and many of them are pure documentary. Yeah. Wonderland is a documentary series that often has foreign
and so does Storyville.
And so does Storyville, most famously. So I'm sorry I can't entirely speak for Charlotte in her output, but I do think we do cover quite a large part of the waterfront.
There is a perception, it may only be a perception, amongst documentary makers that more that would have previously appeared on BBC Two now gets pushed onto BBC Four, and what gets commissioned goes out at more marginal times. Is that a fair perception?
I think only in that it's a more and more competitive climate on BBC Two, and therefore you have to fight that much harder to get the slot. And we work particularly hard because we have a guarantee in current affairs, and we need to be justifying the slots we get. I don't think it's slippage over to BBC 4, because I think BBC 4 is actually doing a different kind of thing. A number of BBC 4 ones come back now to BBC 2 in order to shore up the seriousness of the content, if you like. I think you need to look at both sides. It's not always just what's in front of you.
Okay. Yes, please, at the back there.
Forgive me if I'm backtracking a bit, but I just wanted to go back to...
Do you want to identify yourself first?
My name's Aaron. I'm a print journalist, actually. I'm doing a postgrad at City. Yeah. This lady's comment about trying to get hold of Unreported World and finding a 6-part YouTube video, I was quite surprised by your comments that someone's done a paper and they find there's more bums on seats, but I feel that, like a tidal wave, people are basically becoming much more involved in watching television or the internet. I can't think of any of my friends, especially all of my friends who are into international television shows, who watch it on TV, who are in at 9 o'clock to watch an Unreported World or whatever time it's on. I think that fighting it with an academic paper is quite short-sighted, especially for younger people.
My friends watch foreign news on live station.
I've tried to get... I was in Iran this summer and I was trying to get hold of Unreported World. I mean, if it was through a platform like iTunes or something, which isn't censored on the internet, like
okay,
YouTube
I don't want to get into too detailed an argument about whether or not the research is right or wrong, or that's your perception. But
I don't watch anything that's playing at that time. But when you get TVs that just feeds...
Hold on a second. Let me just wait for the microphone to get to you. Yep, please.
Yeah. So that was my question too.
Just very similar along the same things. I love TV, I work at TV, but I don't watch anything when it's actually playing. I watch it all on my on the computer and stuff. And that's why I love radio too, because you can listen to it any time. Is when you get TVs where it's being pumped in, the internet's getting pumped into the TV in front of your sofa, is that going to change? Sound like that's not the future at all. That was a really surprising comment. So if you
that's quite interesting. I mean, there are technical problems there in actually mimicking TV quality through the internet, and to some extent Project Canvas, which is that they're now talking about, that will be an open access platform, but once we start getting into high definition, for example, very, very difficult to mimic high definition over the internet. All I can say to all these people who say I only watch television via the internet is you are in a very small minority. Let me say one more thing. Let me say one more thing.
Actually, I want to say something on this as well.
I'm just telling you.
Data, data, or are you just going to carry on with opinion?
I'm quoting data. Okay.
Did you have young people as well?
Hey, listen.
This isn't my research.
The fundamental point you're making is not an argument about numbers. The fundamental argument is an argument about change, a different way of dealing with things.
Sorry,
whether it's 1% now or whether it's 10%, whether there are distortions in the data because loads of people gather to watch Strictly Come Dancing together, I don't care. The fundamental point is that whether we like it or not, the various ways in which we consume television are inevitably changing. Whether it's a function of competition, whether it's a function of technology, whether it's a function of people moving around, any number of different things. And the fact is, all those opportunities now exist in some way. Whether you're downloading things over Voos or whether you're downloading off iTunes, there's a whole number of different ways of doing it. The fundamental point is that the content we make is what you are trying to watch. The only thing you are disputing is when you watch it. Don't make me watch it at 7:30 if I want to watch Unreported World. Yeah?
You're not changing.
Hold on. What I'm saying, at the moment, the dilemma we face, and it is a dilemma, is we are straddled between a world which is still fundamental predicated on a schedule and what follows with a schedule, broadcast, advertising and so on, and new forms of distribution which the BBC have done, which we have done, which start making programmes available outside of the schedule. And the moment those two things are sort of tussling with each other as the primary way of which people consume. The one thing you've all got to remember is that you won't start watching stuff non-linearly off iPlayer or off 4OD if you don't know the things there, if it doesn't have a reputation, if it doesn't have importance. And you can't rely on the fact that The Guardian is going to tell you about The Wire as the thing you should watch. And that's the big problem. So in the middle of your question about consumption is, how do you know what's there and how do you know what's valuable? And that's the dilemma that we're all playing with at the moment. We're caught between those two worlds.
Yeah,
that's absolutely right.
I think it's interesting that there's so much heat about this when both of us both of our organisations are fully geared up for the new world. As Ed says, you're still going to be watching the programme in whichever way it is delivered, and I'm afraid, the BBC absolutely takes it seriously. That's why it's brought in the iPlayer and everything else. That's why it's making so much available online. But the fact is, it's the programmes that matter, not, in my view, precisely how you watch them.
I don't want to get too swept aside, by the way, about viewing habits and whether it's all going online or whether it's staying with linear television or so. That's another session, and I'm sure the Frontline Club would love to run it. But I'm going with the flow for a moment, so please.
Hi, my name's Brian Condon.
And you are?
Brian Condon.
Yep. Excellent. Okay.
The point about this debate, I thought it was going to be a debate, and it seems to have turned into questions mostly critical from the audience and rebuttal from the panel, which is not debate in my view. As a matter of fact, Ofcom say that 28% of UK households use the internet to watch catch-up TV online. So I think the numbers are bigger than you're suggesting, but that doesn't really matter.
Sorry, what proportion of total viewing is online? That's the crucial question. But anyway, I think
the proportion is small, but the delta is quite big. It's gone from 17 to 27 in a year.
We've established that's actually irrelevant. The crucial thing is that
I don't think you have established that at all.
On any platforms at any time. I think that's the crucial question.
But I mean, the presenting question, apparently, according to the title of the session, was, will international coverage survive the digital age?
Yeah.
And I haven't heard a satisfactory answer to that.
Okay, I'll give you one. I made it earlier to Juliana, and I'll give it you again. And this may be a belief, and maybe a belief based out of my deep soul. I spent my life covering current affairs and getting shot at. But anyway, okay? The fact of the matter, it seems to me, is that whether or not our domestic audience goes up or down for these programmes, and I suspect that as more and more people become used to accessing programmes in different ways, they will develop a taste for the things that they otherwise miss. They couldn't be bothered to see that they were having a bath, while it was on. But even if that doesn't happen, even if that's cloud cuckoo land, the one thing I do know is true is that if British broadcasters are making worthwhile, well-invested, thoughtful programmes about important stories outside of the UK, that's the one point where we have contact with everybody else in the world. Because there are a lot of, you know, whether we're making about France or the Congo, there are 160 odd countries in the world who are equally interested in France and the Congo. And if we happen to be the market leader doing it, and frankly we are, you ask the people at Frontline in America or own box office where they go to first for their foreign shows. If we are the leaders at doing that, the ability to find those things in a different, non-linear way will keep it going, I believe. Because now the only issue becomes, and it comes back to this fundamental dilemma, at what point do we, horrible word, choose to monetize that and use it as a way of resourcing back into the programs? But I believe that's where the fundamental point comes to. Call it religious, but I do.
Oh. Okay, yeah, I meant the gentleman in front, but okay. I'm going to take both of you at the same time.
Marcus there, I'm a freelancer available for hire if anybody wants me. I just wanted to change tack slightly. I wondered what difference you think it would make to foreign coverage if a chunk of the UK TV licence fee was made more widely available to other broadcasters.
Oh, here we go.
Let me start with you, Ed.
Okay, are you asking me? Well, let me put my corporate hat on and my personal hat. Corporately, there was a period clearly where Channel 4, having identified £150 million funding gap, certainly wasn't adverse, it would appear, to some help, and so on. If you want my... And Andy Duncan is no longer at Channel 4. That may give you an answer. If you ask my personal view, for what it's worth, but I'm here anyway, I don't think we should ever have asked the BBC for the money, or that necessarily we should have taken the licence fee and turned it into some sort of public fund. Because apart from anything else, it would have eroded the BBC.
So you think foreign coverage would be worse if the licence fee was spread around?
And so I think foreign coverage is pretty healthy as it is without dividing the licence fee around.
And the BBC obviously is against top slicing, as you will be well aware, because it utterly dilutes the unique argument for the licence fee that it is for the BBC itself. And as soon as it becomes a general fund that politicians can shunt around, it'll get cut. Well, it may well get cut after next election anyway, but it'll get cut even more.
But what if it was to be a fund that was dedicated to 3 specific things? If it was to be dedicated to local news, to children's programming, and to international coverage?
Do you think the average person out on the street who pays the licence fee willingly or otherwise would be able to put their hand up quite so freely for that as they will simply for the BBC? Yeah. The BBC is, an institution.
Is this an issue that's going to come up in your committee meeting tomorrow?
It's the wrong question. Well, in fact, the Lords have already pronounced on this, the Lords Select Committee. I wasn't advising them at the time, and they came out in favour of top slice.
Yeah, they did.
OK, if that's the wrong question, what's the right question?
The right question is, how do you fund better public service, or how do you better fund public service broadcasting? And this is the one thing I take issue with Phil's report, which was actually quite pessimistic about there being other means of funding. Raising the licence fee is lazy. It's easy and it's lazy. It's a pot of money, it's there, politicians love it, let's grab it. And one of the things we've been brilliant at in this country, Channel 4 is a perfect example, is finding really innovative, thoughtful solutions to these cultural problems. And I won't go through them now, but there are at least 6 other ways in which it's possible to think imaginatively about raising money. Sarkozy's done it in France, the Spanish have done it in another way in Spain. The BBC is suggesting a very interesting idea of using money from selling off the spectrum. There are 3 or 4 others. There are ways in which you can monetize certain aspects of programming and technology in order to raise the money to put it into public service broadcasting. And much as I admire, and I'd love Andy Duncan when he was Chief Executive of Channel 4, he never got his head round why it was a catastrophic idea for Channel 4 ever to think that they should take public money. Taking public money has so many consequences, as the BBC will tell you over 80 years. It should never have been content.
And it would raise a fundamental philosophical problem about Channel 4's editorial position.
Absolutely.
We couldn't be fundamentally different or partial in the way that we are at the moment once we become part of this sort of great collective part. It just becomes very difficult.
I'm going to ask him to hold that because I want to get the gentleman in front of you in. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Steve Turner. I make material on behalf of international organisations, and then try and get it placed on broadcast TV. I really have a question, mainly for the two commissioners. Coming in this evening, what I have perceived from the discussion is the status quo, and you have actually declared that the situation with regard to international programming is actually much better than my subjective opinion was when I came in the door this evening. I feel there's a little bit of banner waving, a little bit of protection and rebuttal.
Forgive us.
But what I would like to know, what are the challenges that are facing you? What's going to happen in the next 5 years? Are there going to be more dilution of funds? Is there going to be an expansion of channels without an increase of funding? What are your difficulties and what will the consequences be?
Well, the BBC, as you probably know, is undergoing a strategic review at the moment and intending, frankly, to slim down in the face of possible cuts of the licence fee. It's broadly expected that if the Tories win, they will cut the licence fee further. My hope is that because current affairs is such a core part of the public service mission, that if there's one place within the BBC that there's a reasonable chance of getting away without cuts, it will be news and current affairs. But everything is up for grabs. All the channels are being reviewed as well. It could be conceivably one of the digital channels that goes. It could be other services. So it's going to be a tough climate, but it has been a tough climate, frankly, for as long as I've been in television, and it's been one of radically shrinking budgets throughout that time. And basically, we've used a hell of a lot of ingenuity and sweat and whatever to continue to make world-class programs. And I don't regard that as simply defending the status quo. I think that's the best. It's a very good thing to do and the best thing we can do, and we will carry on doing it. Now, as to whether it's going to shrink, it's clearly going to shrink in some sense further in the future. The question is just how will we sustain all the range of programming that we have in that shrinking world? And I don't think I can frankly answer that at the moment.
The other thing that's happened recently is there's been a fundamental distortion that's entered into the whole debate about the future of broadcasting. And Channel 4, particularly Andy Duncan, was as guilty of this as anybody else. And Stephen Carter was particularly guilty of this. It's become an argument, as somebody said earlier, Stephen said earlier, partly about technology and partly about money. It's become an economic argument. It's become an argument about public sector, not about public service. Now, I don't know if this precisely answers your question, but it raises what I think are the next piece of battleground, and this is where your question is going to be answered. What we're talking about here, the real question we have to ask ourselves is a cultural question. Do we believe that in the so-called values of public service there is something fundamentally important? As we go from 2 channels to 3 channels to 93 channels to 103 to 203, are we worried about something going missing in there? And if the market will not provide that for whatever reason, if the market will not be able to provide that for any reason, do we culturally believe that certain things are worth holding on to? Now, they may not be just children's programme, local news and current foreign affairs, because there may be an argument for certain forms of the arts, although Sky Arts may demonstrate that that isn't necessarily true. So there may be commercial possibilities. But the argument is a cultural one at a fundamental level. So the question I would ask, and the question I sort of, if you like, will continue banging on about until somebody basically big brothers me to my grave, is when you have to say, at the point, if we don't believe that there is a fundamental cultural importance in public service broadcasting, and if we don't believe that is located in certain forms of serious, challenging ideas, whether that's in the arts, whether it's in serving audiences who wouldn't otherwise be served by majority market broadcasting, which actually strangely can include kids in certain respects, then if we don't believe that, then the whole thing will just fall apart. We'll just say, fine, it'll all look like some gigantic EPG and reruns of CSI. But up until that point, we have to fight the cultural argument. And your argument basically relies on that. We can't tell you that in 5 years we won't have less money and what the consequence will be. But if we have less money and an imperative to keep the culture, that cultural argument going and that cultural position sustained, then I can see no reason why news and current affairs and foreign coverage as part of news and current affairs won't be one of the things which is chosen to survive.
Please.
My name's Elizabeth Blunt. I've been working in international news based overseas, and this has been about big, expensive television programmes commissioned from the UK. But surely there has to be a relationship, because in order to know what you want to make your programmes about, you need to know what's new, what's going on out there. Now, what concerns me is, over the years, I've met fewer and fewer and fewer British colleagues from any part of the media based overseas. As you say, bureaus are closing, people are being parachuted in, and in the digital age, the same stories are going round and round and round and round. And so isn't there a risk you're going to end up making the same stories, as you say, about Latin America, the gangs, the drugs, the rainforest, because you've lost the roots that are feeding into it?
Well, it actually comes back to what I thought what Ed just said was brilliant. Actually, it was a superbly eloquent portrayal of what the future might be like if we're not prepared to stand up and fight for it, and that's one of them. It's you know, you have a gradually eroding base of organisations or individuals who can actually bring you the news from the ground. And I mean, Mark Thompson wrote recently that he was talking to an American senior network executive, who said very soon the American networks are going to pull out of international reporting, and what's going to be left are the wires and the BBC.
They have already.
Well, they insist, if you talk to ABC, for example, they would insist that they have what they call one-person bureau. And
but you have to look. I watched. I was 40 years a foreign correspondent. I feel like I have to. Tom Fenton, CBS.
Okay. I defer.
I feel like I have to say something, because what I've been listening to this evening doesn't square with what my eyeballs see here. That you're going down the same slippery road that we went down in the United States. You're not as far down it as we are, but the same obsessions with eyeballs, getting people in with the competitive atmosphere and all the rest. Why the hell do you have taxpayer financed public service television and radio if this is such an obsession with you now? You are precisely doing the same sort of thing that we've done. Your report, Phil, is, from what I've been able to read here in listening, is pretty square on.
Can I mean, first of all,
and you know, if ABC's got these one-man bands, one-women bands, they're very good, but you're beginning to see them on the air. That may be the future, but we are so demobilized. We've gotten rid of all the foreign bureaus, ABC, NBC, CBS, all but just a handful. There's much less there, but we stopped covering foreign news a long time ago. We packaged.
Can I say, first of all, I mean, I've never met Tom Fenton before. I have just read his book, and which I thoroughly recommend to everyone in here, because it's a brilliant book. I think you're wrong to suggest that the UK...
Great book, but wrong.
I still defer. I think everything
held up the BBC as an example of the
everything you've written about the US is absolutely right. I think you're wrong to say that the UK is culturally and economically going down the same route. I don't think we are obsessed commercially for all sorts of historical, partly to do with the BBC, partly to do with cultural public service. We're not in the same mindset as American television. And I don't think we're going down that route. I do think there is a problem with financing, convincing in particular an incoming Conservative government that the BBC has still got to be a well-funded, mass audience public broadcaster, and that there is still a need for other sources of funding for public service broadcasting. So there is still a gap, but our mindset, honestly, I still think is, partly to the BBC, is different from that obsession with you've got to get the ABC ones in numbers in front of the sets at 7:30.
I think I'd also like to strike a more optimistic note here, because everyone has been so pessimistic. Remember that technology is moving in our direction. The world is getting a smaller place, user-generated content. Actually, the web is providing feedback about what's going on around the world back to us much more easily. So yes, we may not have quite so many people down on the ground, but I bet you we understand what's going on mostly around the world much more, all of us, than we ever did before. So
well, no, I mean,
yeah,
I'm sorry. You know, ever read what was it? What was the Graham Greene's book about Vietnam?
Quiet American.
Quiet American. And, you know, he's sending back his little report. Remember that? You know, and nobody knew what was happening in Vietnam at that time. And there was he, you know, sending back his one report. And he was the only person who told anybody about it. Now there are hundreds of people sending that sort of information around the world. So that sort of idea of the one-man bureau, or the bureaus being the only touchstone on the ground. These were outposts of empire, as far as we were concerned. They were basically glorified outposts of empire, and they've now been replaced by thousands of people who've got access to cheap technology to communicate their stories. And whether they're on YouTube or whatever they are. I disagree with what you're saying about the web, and I find it slightly ironic that on the one hand we can hold up the web as a technology of delivery, as something which is replacing television, on the other hand repudiate it as a way of communicating ideas from people who otherwise wouldn't get access to a medium. Certainly wouldn't get access to Michael Caine playing, the reporter in Vietnam.
Yep, the one at the back there, please. Yep.
Hi, I'm Freddie West. I'm a general interest, nothing to do with the media. I've just done an MBA in America. So the 2 quick points. The first point is, after 4 years in America, I've come back to the UK, and in every way it's turning into America. I absolutely agree with the gentleman in front's point. I was horrified to come back to the UK and find that TV culture, particularly the BBC in fact, is becoming Americanized in every way. Second point is, I think there's been so much heat amongst the young people in the room about business models, not because we're obsessed by the web, but because we believe very, very strongly in your cultural point, I think. We believe very strongly in the importance of what we're talking about here. But to safeguard that and defend that and prevent England from turning into a mini America, we need very clearly to understand the economic model. And the problem with the TV at the moment, I think, is that there's a danger that it will turn into something analogous to the recording industry, which missed its opportunity, didn't understand what was happening economically, and is now struggling to catch up. I think our fear is we believe very, very strongly in the importance of what you're talking about, in the importance of the cultural industry, but we don't hear from you guys a sense that you understand how that will be funded, or a sense of the rapidity with which our generation is changing.
And could you just hand the microphone to the person on your right, please, who I think is Norma Percy, who I think I spy at the back of the room, award-winning international coverage. Norma, what's your view on this? What's your view on the future of international coverage and the sort of documentaries you make?
Well, I keep making them. I've been making them for 40 years, and Clive keeps commissioning them. One, maybe
currently
even two.
commissioned 2 big series.
Maybe even
from
2.
You.
I mean, I think as long as the BBC continues, as long as the license fee continues to go to the BBC, people like me, people like Eamon, will be able to make documentaries. And if that's what is it? Less is more? Fewer in quality?
Fewer, bigger, better.
Fewer, bigger, better. Fewer, bigger, better sounds great. I mean, if the BBC is prepared to let me spend 2 years trying to get Iranians to give interviews, I'm all for it. And I mean, I remember we made End of Empire for Grenada in 1985, 14-part series about how Britain left each of its major colonies. That took 5 years. That was for Grenada, ITV, prime time. Actually, it went out first on Channel 4 and it was repeated on ITV. That was when ITV had a sensible way of funding, that there was some incentive to produce some quality. Mrs. Thatcher ruined that, and one just sort of hopes that David Cameron doesn't touch a system with the BBC that works.
Yeah, that's an optimistic view. Yeah, please. Last 2 points. I'm going to take one here, please, one here, and then there. Last 3 points. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Sanne Rosenbaum. I work for a Dutch newspaper in the Dutch Current Affairs programme, both as a UK correspondent. And I was wondering about the international aspect of it, because I also notice, I've only done this for 2 years, but I already noticed that there's less interest as the credit crunch hits the television programme. They want less from the UK or any other foreign lands. So I was wondering if you have any idea where the UK ranks compared to, well, we touched on America, but compared to other European countries. Is your interest generally broader than German interest in foreign affairs? I mean, is there any idea on how other countries are coping with this?
Okay, I'm going to come to all of our panelists to wrap up at the very end. Yeah, please, here.
Hi, this is Arzu Sak. I'm a freelancer. Going upon the issue of bureaus closing all over the world, are we going more in the direction, since we're talking about international coverage in the digital age, of what we've seen about the Iranian protests, that we're going to get quite Americans all over the world sending their stuff, and if we deem it important, then we'll send a reporter out to cover it, and they won't be based there, they won't be in the story. Yeah.
Okay, and finally at the back, please.
Hello, my name's Vaughan Smith. I worked as a freelance, and the BBC was a customer of mine quite a lot, and it occurred to me that perhaps it might be easier to justify the sort of support the BBC gets from us, from our money, if they could collaborate a little bit more and perhaps be better at working with other smaller outfits in Britain. But actually, it's not at all the case. I've been shot more times than I've had a credit from the BBC for work I've been providing. And okay, there was a period of time where we saw a lot of ex-BBC types get rather rich with production companies on the basis of you know, commissions and things they got. But it wasn't spread around very far, and it certainly wasn't spread around to the organisation that predated the one you're sitting in now.
Okay, I'm going to come to our panel for closing thoughts, and pleased to deal with those questions as well.
Okay, well, I don't know about the rest of Europe. I know that Dutch system, because of the shifting system, means that certain people get finance for discrete projects. So maybe that gives, you know, is a different way of funding public service broadcasting. I know both, you know, the German and French broadcasters have withdrawn bureaus never had many bureaus, and withdrawn them more quickly than we have. So, but I can't really say anything more intelligent than I know where Germany is, and it's just next to France. On the bureaus question, I think we have to be careful here. The bureaus grew up at a time when communications were far more difficult, frankly, and your ability to get to people and so on. The idea that this was a tradition which went back to Victorian newspapers and so on, and to Mafeking and all that sort of stuff, and Rudyard Kipling. The fact is that if we get news out of, an unadulterated news out of Iran during the protests, because a lot of citizen journalists are providing with us, good, frankly. Because I'd rather have that than the correspondent is sitting there in fear of his or her life or his or her visa if he doesn't say the right thing, which is what can happen in countries like Iran, and it can happen in countries like China and so on. So, frankly, I should see this as a positive, not so sort of worry about the bureaus, which can be a slightly sort of, you know, parochial interest. The final point I'd like to make, really, was coming back to this sort of fundamental point of this seminar. Do I think of this debate, do I think fundamentally that current affairs, foreign affairs in particular, is going to be threatened by the digital age? Now, I've made the same point twice, and it's self-evident I don't think that. But I think the one thing you think about very simply is the digital age, whatever that means, has been the best shot in the arm that coverage the world has ever had. It has made our access to the rest of the world in a whole number of different ways, not just by sending teams out on Unreported World or filmmakers. It has given us an opportunity to see things in a whole variety of ways that we wouldn't otherwise do. And if broadcasting can offer a particular perspective, a particular way of doing that within that whole Catholic group of events whereby we see the world, then fine. And I think rather than saying digital kills us, digital doesn't kill the foreign journalist star. Digital makes it possible for him or her to work in a way that we've never been able to work before. And I think that's the way we should see it.
That is really interesting. And what Ed has raised right at the end is a question about the definition of journalism, actually. And I think that does really matter in terms of foreign coverage. And this is something that I know the College of Journalism is grappling with, but there's no question that digital opportunities make it much, much easier to generate information and to send it to all parts of the world on a one-to-one basis in a millisecond. What do you actually do with that information? How do you check the provenance of it? How do you check the authenticity of it? At what point do you say, well, actually, we're not quite sure if that particular demonstration was something created for this particular mobile phone user who wanted to create an impression that there was a huge insurgence. Think about the statue of Saddam Hussein toppling over. The camera pans back and you realise that there aren't huge thousands, hundreds and thousands of demonstrators around it. There's a few gathered around it, and that makes it a very different kind of event. So you need professional journalists, you need people on the spot to some extent. I'm not saying that we abandon all idea of using new digitalized forms of information, but I do think it raises different questions, and therefore you need the money, you need the economic, and that is where I worry. And I am less optimistic and less sanguine, I'm afraid, than either Ed or Clive, because the economic model that has underscored public service broadcasting, including in particular foreign affairs journalism, is crumbling, and there isn't anything obvious to replace it. I must just make one more point. Having said all that, to suggest that our broadcasting system is going the same way as America, I'm sorry, I spend a lot of time in the States, it just ain't so. You cannot compare the BBC News at 10 o'clock, Channel 4 News at 7, Death of Yugoslavia, or whatever Norman and the people have come up with more recently, I'm probably not up to date. That, you just don't get that on America. I'm not talking about HBO, I'm not talking about the what, I'm talking about free-to-air, universally available public service broadcasting. It doesn't happen over there.
Clive.
I just left a personal apology to the gentleman who never got a credit up there, and I'll try and do something about it. The BBC obviously is concerned to reach out and work with all sorts of people up and down the country, and that's why, for instance, we volunteered to provide coverage to local news, to share coverage and pool coverage of local news. I think the one point I'd just make at the end, I absolutely don't want to appear, and obviously some people do think that I've come across as that, as in any sense complacent. No one at the BBC is complacent. We're straining every nerve and sinew we can to make sure that public service broadcasting is protected, that the very best programming is still being made, as many people have testified to here, and that we continue to make it for as long as is conceivably possible. Clearly, there are going to be difficult times in terms of the funding, and the BBC, as some people have suggested, should be subscription, should be all sorts of other things, which are fundamental threats to the kind of breadth of coverage that everyone, I think, in this room would like to see preserved. But the fact is that the economic model is getting tougher and tougher and tougher, and it would be foolish to ignore that. We will continue to make the very best programs for as long as we conceivably can. And I'm afraid that's all I, without a crystal ball, can say at this moment.
Before I invite you to thank our panel tonight, and we should thank them very warmly, I just want to leave you with one quote. It is this. It's a brief quote, but I'll give it to you. I do not advocate that we turn television into a 27-inch wailing wall, where long hairs constantly moan about the state of our culture and our defence. But I would just like to see it reflect occasionally the hard, unyielding realities of the world in which we live. This instrument can teach, it can illuminate, yes, and it can even inspire. But it can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use it to those ends. Otherwise, it is merely wires and lights in a box. Many of you will recognise that quote.
Good night and good luck.
It's Ed Murrow, and it's 51 years ago, and it could still be today. Will you thank our panel, because they've been brilliant.